So it turns out we may have gone 4K crazy, and we've got another 4K 40-inch monitor for you to look at today. Alright, so we've taken a look at the AMH A399U and the Wasabi Mango 42-inch UHD 420, I think. For this one, this is the AMH A409U. This is sort of the spiritual successor, I guess, to the A399. Now, the A399 was not a perfect monitor, but it was pretty good. It was actually really impressively good considering the price point and the features. It's kind of weird because you have to order it on eBay or otherwise import it from South Korea. But we're going to take a look at the AMH A409U, the A409U. This monitor is massive. Look, I've been a member of the Wall O Monitors Club since 1998, and having fewer larger monitors versus a bunch of smaller ones probably is the way to go. Honestly, I really didn't think like that until actually laying hands on a 40-inch display. I like the 27-inch displays, but I also like having some ancillary 1920 by 1200 and 1920 by 1080 displays. With 4K, I can still have my ancillary 1920 by 1080 displays and 1920 by 1200 displays, but also roll with my 4K. So overall, until 5K monitors come out in about 45 inches or 46 inches, the 4K 40-inch monitor is probably what I'm going to rock. And surprisingly, we have a forum post about this monitor and the A399 and some other 40-inch monitors, because 4K and 40 inches, it really makes sense for a lot of reasons. If you've used a 27-inch 2560 by 1440 resolution display, the amount of pixels that you get in that 27-inch monitor, the density of those pixels is basically the same at 4K 40 inches. So we're talking about 108 pixels per inch, give or take. And at that resolution, the display is just 40 inches big instead of 27 inches big. So in terms of like the size of stuff on your display, it's the same size on a 27-inch as a 40-inch. It's just on the 40-inch you've got a lot more pixels. The other thing that factors in here is that Windows display scaling is basically awful. And so 4K works really well because you don't have to use Windows display scaling. You can use everything sized at 100%. And yeah, it's kind of small, but your display is 40 inches. It's like having four 1920 by 1080 monitors in a 2x2 configuration. This is a really, really solid setup. Windows 10 even has quadrant maximization. You can hit window up, window down, window left, window right, and the windows will maximize either to half the screen or a quadrant of the screen, a 1920 by 1080 quadrant of the screen. That works really well. And that's not just specific to this monitor, that's just 4K in general, because you may be sitting here watching this thinking, wow, you're a crazy person. Why would you ever want a 40-inch display on your computer? Don't knock it till you tried it. We really have to step back for a minute and think the people in South Korea are really innovating here. I haven't seen anything like this stateside, and I think that just this approach is really innovative. It's 4K, it's 40 inches. They're not really TVs. They're TVs that are sort of kind of being customized to be computer displays, because there are not really a lot of computer display manufacturers that are figuring that anybody wants to go with a 4K display. I wouldn't be surprised if Apple comes out with a 40-inch iMac that has like an 8K resolution or something like that. That's how transformative this thing is. It's like, oh, I need a video production iMac, but that's a story for another time. And I'll mention it while I'm thinking about it, because I'll probably forget later. The pixel layout on these monitors is a blue, green, red layout. Now, these monitors all use the Super MVA format. It's a VA panel, which puts it somewhere between IPS in terms of quality and TN. So it's a better display in general than a TN display, but it's not as good as IPS in terms of color reproduction, NTSC gamut, things like that. There are conflicting bits of information in the spec PDF on the Super MVA panel to know what its true NTSC color gamut is, and to know the Adobe sRGB color space. So if you're into that kind of thing, you probably should head on over to the forums at techsyndicate.com so you can take a look at the thread there, because there's a bunch of Adobe people in there. Generally, I can tell you that there is a little bit of color bleed. That's also true on the A399, but it's so much better than the Philips, because we were side-by-siding this with the Philips 4K display that's also really popular on the internet for the same reasons. And the bleed is way, way better on this monitor than the Philips. The Philips has got awful bleeding. And when we did the testing, it was like, oh, let's do the testing. Oh, no bleed, because we were looking for bleed as bad as the Philips bleed. Well, it turns out on a 50% gray, you get a little bit of bleed, but it's not insanely terrible. So if that's a showstopper for you, just be aware of it. These monitors are not perfect, but they're pretty damn good. Now with the Super MVA panel, blacks are deep and whites are bright. One big improvement over the A399 is that this display has a flicker-free backlight. Now this display, unlike the A399, comes at about 50% brightness, and the brightness can actually go up quite a bit from where it is. Although I don't think you'll really want to set the brightness much past 60 or 70, because at those brightnesses, the blacks are not as black. Out of the box, brightness brightness of 50 or 60, for me, for my preferences, I found it to be pretty good. Whereas on the A399, I was cranking it. So subjectively, backlight uniformity and backlight brightness is very, very much improved over the A399. The biggest improvement, of course, is that the backlight is flicker free. Now, the internal controller on this has also been swapped. I think it's a different setup or a different brand. This seems to be the same controller vendor as we saw in the Wasabi Mango. Now, the Wasabi Mango was FreeSync. This display, as I reviewed it, was not FreeSync, but I do know of another monitor that has the exact same controller, and that monitor is FreeSync. And so we've got a video coming up on that monitor as well, 4K, 40 inches, Super NVA. Different vendor, similar components, different aesthetic, and I kind of like that monitor too. And the fact that there are so many monitors around this price point that are delivering a really good value is only good for the consumer. We're going to have some really amazing 4K displays probably next year. I mean, maybe next year we'll get our dream display of 4K, 120 Hz at 1080p, FreeSync and G-Sync support, 40 inches, you know, the whole 9 yards, because nobody seems interested in building that kind of a monitor, or, you know, they do, but it's, you know, $1,500, where you can almost buy 3 of these for that, at least at the time of this video, at least in America. Now, with that swapped controller, you can actually overclock it, although you start to get significant frame drops much past 70 Hz. You're not going to be overclocking it at 4K, there's just not enough bandwidth for that. But if you run it at 1080p, you can get about 70 Hz, at least on the model that I had, before you started getting significant frame drops. If you can't game at 4K, don't worry, because 4K is an exact multiple of 1080p. You can scale this display to 1080p, set up your game resolution to be 1080p. It actually looks really good on this display. Now, this display, unlike the A399, also includes options in the on-screen controls. And let me tell you, you're going to want to fiddle with stuff in the on-screen controls. The first thing you're going to want to do when you take this out of the box is configure it to be in English, because out of the box it comes in not English, and you'll probably want to set that to English. There are also controls for gamma, it's 2.4 out of the box. Color correction, you've got individual control of red, green, and blue. There's also an option for whether or not you're doing processing or filtering. And so this is something that I played with. I was curious about what the overall latency was, so I set up a CRT monitor sort of versus this monitor. And from the testing, the CRT monitor was about 4 frames per second ahead of this particular monitor. So playing with the on-screen controls and the different settings and setting the latency mode to low, I was actually able to shave about 16 to 20 milliseconds off of that figure. 64 milliseconds is sort of the overall number that you would expect when the monitor is running about 4 frames behind a CRT. And so being able to save 16 milliseconds, maybe 20 milliseconds, depending on how you average the numbers and put it together. It's hard to do this with a camera and get something that's mostly accurate, but we do with what we've got. So overall, you'll probably want to play with that. In terms of like the color bleed that I mentioned before, this actually is also something that is affected a little bit by the on-screen controls. Although it seems like for some of the on-screen controls, you actually have to pull power from the display and plug it back in order for those changes to take effect. Some of the effects take effect immediately, other effects not so much. One other cool thing with the on-screen display for this monitor is that you can hit a crosshairs button and you'll get crosshairs on your display. No matter what's on the screen, you're going to have crosshairs in the middle of the screen. That's a pretty neat feature. I know a lot of high-end and gaming monitors have had that feature for a long time, but it's pretty unusual to see it at a monitor at this price point. So again, you know, kudos to the Koreans for doing such a good job, knowing their market and knowing that people like us are buying these kinds of displays. Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good. The inputs include HDMI 2.0, HDMI 1.4, DisplayPort 1.2, and VGA, which is kind of weird. And it also has optical SPDIF and a USB service port. Now, this USB service port will allow us to upgrade the firmware. I have seen other 40-inch 4K displays that are FreeSync compatible using the same controller that's in this display, but I have not yet seen a firmware upgrade file that we could put on a USB drive to upgrade this panel to FreeSync compatibility. Theoretically, it should exist, but I haven't seen it. I also can't speculate as to what the FreeSync range would be. My guess would probably be 45 to 60 frames per second, although it may be as low as 42 frames per second to 60 frames per second on FreeSync. But that's just speculation. Both the HDMI 2.0 port and the DisplayPort 1.2 port can drive 4K at 60 Hz with the 444 chroma. Interestingly, unlike the A399, this display does not report 10-bit color per pixel. It only reports 8-bit color per pixel. So I think the controller in the A399 is approximating those last 2 bits. At least that's what I've read from looking at the specs for this actual NVA panel, is that the controller on the A399 is doing some type of interpolation to get those last 2 bits per pixel. So just know that this thing is 8 bits per pixel. Now, I didn't have any trouble with HDCP 2.2, except for sometimes when the display went to sleep, although I think that was sort of down to a dodgy DisplayPort cable. Remembering the DisplayPort cable that came with the A399, The DisplayPort cable that came with this one was a lot better, and it basically was fine out of the box. I was able to plug it in, use it, it instantly hit 4K 60 Hz, no problem syncing up. I did my testing on an Asus 390X and an Asus 980 Ti. Both of those were the Strix Edition versions of those cards. So I was sort of pleasantly surprised that nothing weird happened, except for display sleep stuff. Like the display would go to sleep and wake up and go to sleep, wake up. And that was with the 390X. Updated the catalyst drivers, tried a different cable, and it was fine. Then I switched back to the other cable, and it was still fine. So just know that if you're moving the display around and you've got the cable plugged in, that it's super sensitive about moving it around with the cable. So that's just a quirk, something to keep in mind, just letting you know. Aesthetically, the case is plastic, but it is finished with a metal frame. The A399 was available with and without glass. Without the glass, they just didn't mount it. So the bezel kind of looked like something was missing. Then they tried a metal mount, and so it was kind of weird. This does not come with glass. There's not an option for glass that I know of, at least at the time of the shooting of the video. The bezel is a really nice sort of metal frame, but the rest of the monitor case is like this kind of textured vacuum formed plastic. The monitor does feel a lot sturdier, and I think that is what contributes to the reduction in edge shadowing. So this display does have a little bit of edge shadowing on the edges, but overall it's improved over the A399. The edge shadowing is not as pronounced as it was on the A399. But if you're really nitpicky and you're expecting a perfect monitor, don't expect a perfect monitor. There is a little bit of edge shadowing. But for me, the edge shadowing was not really a big deal. Just be aware of it. The mounting situation here with this monitor is a 200mm by 200mm VESA mount, standard issue. Basically the same as the A399. They did extend the pegs past the end of the case in this case, so that works out a little better than the A399 in my opinion. Also included in the box is a fixed glass base. This is basically a glass plate with some holes drilled in it and some aluminum standoffs with some little rubber things to make sure that you don't break the glass. It also includes an Allen wrench so you can tighten down the bolts, although you'll want to just snug them. You won't actually want to tighten them because that could weaken the glass and be very bad, because then you'd have broken glass in your hands and that sort of thing. Me, personally, I like using these displays with monitor arms or other mounting solutions. Works great. You know, you can do a wall mount, arm mount, whatever you want to do. Just be sure that you can get an arm that can carry the weight of these things. All in all, this monitor, like the A399, is not perfect, but it is an incremental upgrade over the A399. As a result, the A399 is also on fire sale. So if you'd like to pick up an A399, the PWM backlight or flickering backlight doesn't really bother you too much in general on monitors, then you should pick up an A399 because they're on fire sale. But this monitor with the improved brightness and the improved backlight and the promise of FreeSync, it's a pretty good deal. It's not really that much more expensive than the A399, and it is dramatically way cheaper than the other higher end monitors. And the other good thing about these monitors is that it's going to drive the prices of other higher end 4K monitors down. I would like to see a top shelf manufacturer actually sanction this kind of thing, actually put together a dream monitor, 4K, the overclockability or higher frame rates at lower resolutions. There exist TVs that will do 120 Hz at 1080p, but no DisplayPort input. So the panels are out there. I know they exist. The Wasabi Mango has an IPS panel, an LG IPS panel, for example. It can do 120 Hz, but the controller can't keep up with it. So we need those controllers. It's going to be a really interesting year for 4K monitors, and 40 inches is in. We've also got some threads you should check out on the forum at techsyndicate.com. This monitor's already got a really long thread, so people went ahead and bit the bullet and bought it ahead of this review because the A399 was so good. So you should go check that out. There's also a huge thread with a gazillion posts about the A399 in the forums at techsyndicate.com. So if you bought one of these, share your experience, good or bad. We want to hear from you. All in all, I've been really impressed by the experiences that people have posted on the Tech Syndicate forums with these monitors, and they're like, I was a little skeptical, but $500, I figured I could use it as a TV. Oh my god, it was transformative. It's amazing. You're welcome. So yeah, I didn't think this would be anything either, but using it and actually like programming and stuff like that with it, oh my goodness, it is transformative. It is crazy. I'm never going back from 4K at 40 inches. So if you got one of these, I want to hear from you. If you're thinking about buying, head on over to the forum. See you there. I'm Wendell, signing out.